This is a recent photo of Alta Bates Hospital in Berkeley, California. In 1968, yes, a very long time ago, I was hired to set up a drug information center, but occasionally I had to fill in the pharmacy. So one day I got a prescription that read tetracycline 250 milligrams orally 4 times a day and take 60 milliliters of Maalox as an antacid with each dose of tetracycline. Presumably he was trying to reduce any irritation that tetracycline might have on the GI tract. Now, I was writing a book on drug interactions at the time, and I knew that the antacid would totally block the absorption of the tetracycline. He was giving placebo tetracycline. So I called the surgeon, and I assure you I was very polite, but he told me just to fill the prescription, and he slammed the phone down in my ear. He said he'd been using this combination for years, he never saw any problems, and at first I was mystified that a person could use placebo antibiotic for years and not know it. Now I know what his reasoning error was, and we will discuss that later. Greetings, my name is Science-Hansten, and today's topic is scientific inference. What kinds of reasoning do scientists use to come to conclusions? Here are three of the more important ones. This is the first of the three more important ones. Deduction, which is top-down, using general principles to reach specific conclusions. Now, we use deduction when we take some established scientific principle and apply it to specific cases, such as, for example, when we know a drug isn't absorbed well in the presence of antacids, we separate the doses to try to avoid that. It's fairly straightforward, but nonetheless, we regularly make mistakes. Induction is the opposite. It's bottom up, using repeated specific observations to form general conclusions or principles. Now keep in mind, this is a bit oversimplified, but for our purposes, I think this works. Actually, induction usually comes first. First, we use induction, which is the method we use to come to these general principles. But for induction, there are actually many ways of screwing this up, which we will discuss. And it often leads to an underestimation of the importance of adverse drug outcomes. Now here's the last one, which often isn't mentioned. Usually people just talk about deduction and induction, but it's a very important method that is actually underused. It's also called abduction, which I kind of hate that word because I can never remember what it is, but inference to the best explanation is very explanatory. And this is where you study all available evidence and come to the best conclusion. You don't just restrict your study to a certain type of evidence. For example, we do not have many randomized controlled trials for many decisions we make, whether it's drug interactions or wearing masks to prevent COVID transmission, flossing our teeth, and many other things. Insisting on randomized controlled trial evidence can lead to very bad decisions. And there are many examples of this over the last few years. So when Sherlock Holmes solved a crime, he said, "Deduction, my dear Watson, deduction." Was this correct? Nope. I mean, he was a smart guy, but he was using mostly the third one, inference to the best explanation. Never mind, he's a fictional character, but that's what he was doing. Excuse me. And by the way, you can use more than one of these methods at the same time to answer questions and decide what to do. So let's look in a little more detail at deductive reasoning. As I said, this is top-down, using general principles to reach specific true conclusions or probable conclusions in the way we're using it. It is used in science to apply general theories to specific situations. So when we already know something in science, say to a specific patient situation, let's say we know how to avoid an adverse effects from a drug interaction from previous evidence, and we advise the patient about that. Now, philosophers often use deductive reasoning in a very rigorous, logical way, which we're going to expand a bit. But here's an example of reasoning that leads to a new conclusion. First, we have all humans are mortal. Then we say Killian is human. And then finally, therefore, Killian is mortal. Now, the thing about deductive reasoning is if the first two premises are certain, the third one is certain as well. The problem is that in science, almost nothing is certain, so we're dealing with probabilities even when we use deductive reasoning. So what we're concluding is that Killian will not live forever. Now, this might seem like a slam dunk conclusion, but one must always be careful that the first two premises are actually true in all circumstances. For example, I watched videos of some of his goals, and they could make one question the middle statement, that Killian is human. Check this out.
Il va pouvoir choisir le pied droit. Et au second poteau, Mbappé prend le temps de contrôler. Et d'enrouler le génie Kylian Mbappé, 23e minute.
And here's another example. His teammate passed the ball behind him, so he had to improvise. So goals like this could make us question the second premise that Killian is human. Now, I apologize if you have a different football player you think is better than Killian. I didn't mean to offend. I just Googled it. Best football player. Okay, so that's deduction, primarily useful to us in applying known information. Next is induction, bottom-up approach used to where we use repeated specific observations to form general principles. So unlike deduction, this is bottom-up, and it's used all the time in the medical sciences to form general principles. For example, when they started looking at chromosomes of people with Down syndrome, they found that they had 3 copies of chromosome 21 instead of the normal 2 copies. That most people have only 2. So this is classic inductive reasoning. Every single person with Down syndrome that they found had 3 copies of chromosome 21. So you can say you can't say that every single person everywhere who has Downs will have this, but it's a pretty good guess. And by the way, this is not enzyme induction. Since we're talking about drug interactions a lot, this is induction of a totally different type than enzyme induction in drug interactions. Now, the first person to really promote the scientific method using induction was Francis Bacon. Bacon said scientific knowledge must be based on observation and experiment and not from authority and tradition. Now, this sounds very obvious, but what he proposed was revolutionary at the time. So the process he suggested was to seek out patterns in the natural world, propose hypotheses, and do experiments to test those hypotheses. Now, he had help from a distant relative from a few centuries earlier, Roger Bacon, sorry. I forgot his name for a second. Roger Bacon. On the other hand, Kevin Bacon wasn't involved in any of this. So here's just a little interesting history about Francis Bacon. He was born in London, went to Cambridge at age 13. Actually, sounds weird, but actually not that uncommon at the time. And he got involved in government quite a bit. He had a brilliant mind, and he was a marvelous writer. But he was ethically challenged. Alexander Pope said, "The wisest, brightest, meanest of mankind." And I remember Bertrand Russell, the first sentence of his essay, Useless Knowledge, said something to the effect that Francis Bacon, a man who rose to prominence by betraying his friends. That was the first sentence of his essay. So Bacon's essays are still worth reading. I have a copy in the shelves behind me there. But his hypocrisy is a little hard to stomach. One of these essays was on friendship, which really wasn't one of his strong points, as we will discuss now. Here's an example of how he treated his mentor and friend, the Earl of Essex, also known as Robert Devereux. Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, was a favorite of Queen Elizabeth. She apparently had the hots for him, and it's not clear whether there was any relationship there between the two of them, but there may have been. And unfortunately, Devereux lost favor with the Queen after failing at several. He apparently wasn't a really good soldier, but he failed at several military campaigns, especially in Ireland. And he was accused of treason, and Bacon, Francis Bacon, his friend and mentor, eagerly prosecuted his former friend and ended up with the Earl of Essex, Robert Devereux, being executed. He was beheaded at the Tower of London by executioner Thomas Derrick. Interestingly, Derrick was apparently a rapist who earlier had been pardoned by Essex himself, an interesting twist. But right before the execution, Essex denounced his sister Penelope as being a co-conspirator. So for no reason whatsoever, Essex threw his sister under the bus. So Essex, I guess, was kind of as much a slime bag as Bacon was. Okay, enough history. So here's a simplified version of induction and deduction. It's more complicated than this, but this works for our purposes. Deductive reasoning at the top there, you have general principles you apply to individual cases. Inductive reasoning, you have a whole bunch of observations of individual cases, and you eventually come to a general principle. For drug interactions, we use inductive reasoning all the time. We look at what happens in individual cases, and we come to a general principle about that interaction. When it occurs, what kinds of people are predisposed, et cetera, et cetera. Then we can apply that general principle later on to other cases of people getting these drugs. So we use induction all the time, actually. Let's say you go to the grocery store and you buy 4 apples from the same bin. They're the same variety in the same batch. So if the first 3 apples are tart, will the 4th one be tart? Well, we can't be absolutely sure, but we can arrive at some probabilities, which induction provides us with probabilities, not certainties. So it probably will be tart, but it certainly isn't certain that it will be. So this is the kind of induction that we use just, minor situations in everyday life. Now, Hume approached this from a much deeper standpoint, and we'll discuss some of these limitations of induction. There are several ways to go wrong, but we will address the practical limitations, ideas that can be useful in our professional and private lives. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go into detail on Scottish philosopher David Hume's fascinating discussion of the fundamental philosophical problems with induction, but just we can touch on it just very briefly now in a famous example. You've all heard this story. Hume made the point that all swans Europeans saw were white, so they assumed all swans were white. But it only takes one non-white swan, for example, black swans that they found in Australia, to disprove the theory. So nature isn't necessarily uniform. Just because something has always happened in the past doesn't prove that it will continue to. Here's another famous example of the failure of the uniformity of nature. This is Russell's famous chicken. Just because something has always happened in the past doesn't mean it will certainly happen in the future. The farmer feeds a chicken every day for its whole life. One day it wrings its neck. Russell observed wryly that more refined views as to the uniformity of nature would have been useful to the chicken. Now, technically, the same concept applies to heating water to 100 degrees Celsius at sea level. It's always boiled in the past, but there's actually no, I know this is difficult to wrap your head around, but there's no logical reason to expect it will do next time. It's a psychological assumption, not a logical one. But this is fine. This kind of stuff is fine for philosophers to argue over, and they still are, by the way. And Hume knew this sounded silly. And after long discussions of this stuff, Hume would say, okay, let's forget about all this and let's go have a few pints at the local pub. Hume still expected he could boil eggs, but it puts you in a mindset that expands your thinking. This kind of thing helps expand your view of the world. And this is exactly the kind of thing that helped Einstein arrive at relativity. Einstein made it very clear that without David Hume, he would never have come up with relativity, at least not when he did. But for our purposes, there are also practical ways induction can fail that aren't so deeply philosophical, and we need to know about these. So don't forget, deductive reasoning is top-down and is used in science primarily to apply known, and I put known in quotation marks, known theories to specific situations. Inductive reasoning is bottom-up and is a process of using specific observations to form general conclusions or principles. We use both of these frequently in science and in drug interactions. So let's look at one way, this is number one, of ways induction can fail. When something has not been established, we must consider how thorough the search for the evidence was before we declare it false. Now, for Bigfoot, the lack of evidence after centuries of people wandering in the woods of the Northwest suggests that it's highly unlikely that Bigfoot exists. Not impossible, just highly unlikely. And I apologize to all you Bigfoot believers, but we're looking at probabilities here. But here, the search for evidence has been extensive, and our probability assessment is likely to be valid. Probability, not certainty. On the other hand, our failure to find life elsewhere in the universe doesn't tell us much from an inductive standpoint, because, unlike Bigfoot, we have explored only a tiny fraction of the universe for life. And we've already found like 5,000 exoplanets, many in the habitable zone. So we can't say that life doesn't exist elsewhere in the universe because there's no proof that it does. That statement doesn't fly, because we've only examined a very, very small portion of the universe. So like Bigfoot, there's no proof of existence, but unlike Bigfoot, the search hasn't been large enough to make any definite conclusions. Another way to look at this is that absence of proof is not proof of absence. This applies to both Bigfoot and life elsewhere in the universe. But there's just an extremely small chance that Bigfoot exists. Likelihood is not zero, just very close to zero. So using this concept, assume a potential interaction between drug A and drug B, and then you personally observe, let's say, 10 or 20 patients on the combination, and you don't observe any adverse outcomes. So no adverse outcomes observed. You're likely to conclude that the drug interaction is not very important. That's how our brains work. The danger here is that you may disregard a drug interaction that actually is real, but only causes adverse outcomes in some patients. So that if you'd looked at 50 people, you might have seen one or two. It's kind of like Mr. Froggy here. He's looking at the probability of a spawn going to a tadpole, pretty high, 0.8. Then a tadpole going to a frog, quite a bit lower, 0.1. But a frog being kissed by a princess and turning into a prince, you can see a rather low probability. Now, with drug interactions, we're not dealing with that kind of low probability usually, but certainly, oftentimes, nothing close to 1. Here's an example. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, and thiazide diuretics individually can cause hyponatremia, low serum sodium. So they both individually cause that, and the combination appears to be additive. Now, the adverse outcomes range from mild to life-threatening, and it actually can be fatal. Hyponatremia is potentially fatal. It's not common, but now the major risk factors are age over 65, female gender, low body mass index, and by the way, they're new recommendations to use some other form, but in other words, a thin person, low salt diet, and a pre-existing, and that's the last one's pretty obvious, pre-existing low serum sodium. So the woman you see here, this is a stock photo. I just asked for a thin older woman, and they gave me that one. So this person is a prime candidate for hyponatremia. On the other hand, if you deal mostly with younger people who don't have risk factors, the risk is pretty low. In a 40-year-old man with a normal diet and a normal BMI, it's very unlikely that he would have a problem with this drug interaction. So if you deal mostly with such patients, you're very unlikely to see it, and your induction is going to tell you, hey, this is no big deal. If you work in a nursing home with a lot of people looking like this lady on the screen, you're likely to see it on a fairly regular basis. And by the way, just as an aside, there's a statue of David Hume in Edinburgh, and university students rub his toe for good luck, especially if it's a philosophy exam, of course. So that's what it is. The toe has been rubbed shiny by university students, believing really in a superstition, which is interesting. And this is not confined to David Hume. There's a statue in Budapest, Hungary, which is used for the same purpose by university students, and apparently other people who just want good luck. This is in the Buda Castle, and it's a different part of the horse's anatomy. It's not a toe that they rub to obtain good luck. And this is what the Buda Castle looks like from the Danube. Ruth and I were on a bicycling trip in the rural areas of Hungary over a decade ago, and we spent a few days in Budapest. Now, across the river is one of the most beautiful buildings I've ever seen. We took a little night cruise to look at these things. The Hungarian Parliament building, just incredible, all lit up at night. Here we are out in the Hungarian countryside with our tandem bicycle. So another way induction can fail is coming to a conclusion based on one serious event. And this can result in our assuming the risk is much greater than it actually is. And I've seen this happen with drug interactions. Here's a more simple example. This is a coffee pouch used in many hotels. You tear open the foil pouch up here at the top where you see the red arrow, and then you put the pouch, the thing in front there, in the coffee maker and turn it on. Add water and turn it on. Now, this is a barbaric way to make coffee, I might add, but this coffee maker made me make this inductive mistake. I was on the East Coast giving an 8 a.m. lecture at a seminar, which meant getting up at 4 a.m. West Coast time. And obviously I needed coffee very badly. So I ripped open this foil wrapper and accidentally ripped open the coffee pouch, and the coffee grounds fell all over the floor. It was the only one. I had no coffee at all. This was a true disaster, a catastrophe actually. And ever since then, I have been paranoid that it will happen again. I approach these foil wrappers like a neurosurgeon doing a delicate operation. So I now have a distorted view of the danger, and the same thing can happen if a clinician happens to see a serious drug interaction in one of their patients. And they can blow it out of proportion in the future, even if it's a very rare drug interaction. I mean, if that particular drug interaction very rarely causes adverse outcomes, they are much more cautious than necessary about it. Okay, let's go back to that surgeon we talked about at the very beginning of the lecture, the antacid tetracycline drug interaction. This brings up the third way induction can fail: faulty observations of outcomes such that any events that occur are likely to be missed. Now, this surgeon did not, that's not actually him, that's another stock photo, by the way. This surgeon did not detect the drug interaction because his patients very rarely had infections. But obviously wouldn't have had infections anyway because he was giving placebo tetracycline. It wasn't absorbed, so it wasn't doing anything. Now, if he'd looked at serum tetracycline concentrations, which isn't done, but if he had, he would have made a correct observation. But he was looking at the wrong outcome. He was looking at infections which weren't going to happen anyway. So he came to his faulty conclusion. So he fell into this fallacy. And you hear this still today. I heard a lot 50 years ago. I see that combination of drug used all the time, and I've never seen a problem. Therefore, I know that drug interaction is not real. This is a classic failure of the inductive process. Another way of looking at it, Empedocles from ancient Greece, way BC, born in roughly 494 BCE. Each man believes only his experience. And this is the same concept. And it really is a huge problem in drug interactions. And it goes both ways, as I said. False negatives, like the surgeon not believing the tetracycline antacid, and also false positives if you see a problem and figure it was caused by a drug interaction when it was actually caused by something else. Now, this is a philosophical problem. It can best be understood through a philosophical understanding. Now, animals use induction all the time. After the third or fourth time, Yoda, our cat, and Snaky Boy, our other cat, heard the can opener being operated, they assumed that was that was time to eat. So it took them 3 or 4 times, and they said, "Gee, every time I hear that noise, I get food." So they would come running. Here's another example. This juvenile bald eagle, you can't really see the juvenile, he's all upside down, was sitting there minding his own business on the beach in front of our house. And for no reason that I could discern, an adult swooped down and just knocked him crazy. Then it did it again. The adult circled around and did it again, knocked him completely upside down. The third time the adult came down to do it again, the juvenile said, "Wait, I see the pattern here." So the juvenile just flattened himself. The juvenile bald eagle just flattened himself on the beach to avoid getting hit by the adult. So animals use induction. It only took him 2 times to figure out, hey, I better hit the deck here. Another way induction can fail is using induction to assess the risk of drug interactions for which adverse outcomes are infrequent or rare. In all these cases, adverse reactions only occur in a subset. And as you go down these 3, warfarin, fluconazole, where bleeding can occur because of increased warfarin effect, warfarin and SSRIs, also bleeding because of the antiplatelet effects of the SSRIs, and finally beta blockers and epinephrine, which can cause a serious hypertensive reaction. These interactions are real and they do occur, and sometimes they cause serious negative outcomes, but most people getting these drugs do not have a problem, especially that last one. Probably 99.9% of people on beta blockers and epinephrine do not have a serious negative outcome. They might have minor ones, but when it does happen, it is potentially fatal. So let's look at the first one, warfarin and fluconazole. Warfarin is metabolized primarily by this particular enzyme, CYP2C9, and fluconazole is actually a very potent inhibitor of CYP2C9, really very good inhibitor of that enzyme. So you would expect that there would be an interaction between warfarin and fluconazole. It's not guaranteed, but it's very likely given what we know about their properties. And sure enough, a 68-year-old woman on warfarin started fluconazole. 2 days later, her INR had changed very little, but a week later, it had gone up to 51. And she had melena. That's the black tarry stool seen with bleeding higher up in the GI tract. They had to give her fresh frozen plasma to try to stop the bleeding in the intensive care unit. And after 2 weeks after stopping the fluconazole, the warfarin response was normal. This is exactly what one would have expected. Now, this first reported case was from the University of Washington. Our friend Doug Black, who just retired just weeks ago, and from the Department of Pharmacy, and Terry Seaton, the lead author, was a pharmacy fellow a number of years ago. You can see this is quite a while ago, 1990. So 3 years later, there was a study in a larger number of people, 7 people on warfarin given fluconazole. The prothrombin time increased. This is kind of like the INR. It's a similar kind of a measurement by 38%. But it was highly variable variable between subjects. Look at patient number 2 and compare it to patient number 3. Patient number 2 would be in very little danger from this interaction, but patient number 3 would be at risk of bleeding. And this variability that you see here is seen for virtually every drug-drug interaction I have ever seen. If I ever see a drug or a study with a very small variability, I would wonder if somebody made up the data. I keep looking. I haven't found one yet, but maybe nobody does fraud in the drug interaction field. Seems unlikely, but anyway, none of the patients had a bleeding episode. This was short-term. If fluconazole is only given for 7 to 10 days, or sometimes shorter, sometimes it's only given in a single dose or just for 2 days, most people probably won't bleed because the excessive anticoagulation is short-term. But occasionally, people probably would bleed after 7 to 10 days, at least. And longer-term fluconazole, which is used sometimes given for weeks or months, the risk then would go up. So how about the time course? Well, this is the same study, the same 7 people on warfarin. They looked at the time course. There was no increase on day 2. Look at the chart over there on the right. Day 2, there was no effect. Day 5, it had gone up somewhat. And by day 8, it had gone up substantially, more than doubled. So now the fluconazole was stopped early in 3 of the patients due to an INR over 4.5. So they did have to stop it. They were afraid that, they knew they were studying the interaction. They were afraid they might cause bleeding. Here's another case, 44-year-old man on warfarin, took fluconazole for Candida. 2 weeks later, he developed a massive bleed in his left eye. His prothrombin time had increased to 68 seconds. So this was 12 years after the first report. And yet they subjected this person to a serious problem. I don't know if he lost his eye or not, but that's not a good thing. Another case that same year, a 75-year-old man. This was a tragic case. 75-year-old man on warfarin. 2 days before discharge, they started him on 4 weeks of very high dose fluconazole. 4 weeks, 800 milligrams for a week, and then a day for a week, and then 400 milligrams a day for the last 3 weeks. And the physicians told the patient to have an INR done. They knew about the interaction, but they made 3 mistakes that almost proved deadly. And I'll explain those in a minute. So 2 days after discharge, the INR had increased to 4.1, but this was ignored. But they made multiple errors. First, they told the patient to have an INR on day 9 of fluconazole. That was way too late. Secondly, they ignored the increased INR on day 4, that they actually had the evidence that it was already increasing, but that was ignored. And third, they had no follow-up to make sure the patient actually came in for an INR. You can't tell a 75-year-old person, now I'm older than that, so I hate to admit that, but you can't tell a 75-year-old person, hey, come in so many days for a blood check. There should have been some way of checking to make sure he actually came in, which he did not. So 5 weeks later, he went to the emergency department with back pain and leg weakness. His INR was off the charts at 40. He had worsening leg weakness, bladder and bowel incontinence, and the MRI showed an epidural hematoma, a bleed into his brain. He had a long hospital stay, and at discharge, he needed assistance to walk and required ongoing catheterization. So this man had a long-term disability due to failure to manage this drug-drug interaction correctly. And by the way, there are a lot of ways to have a bleed into the brain. This one is an epidural hematoma. We'll talk a little bit later about another type of brain bleed that's also, all these are dangerous, by the way. Okay, another way induction can fail is using induction. Oh, I'm sorry, this is another example of that one. Warfarin and SSRIs and SNRIs. We've already talked about this, so I won't go into a lot of detail. Here's a group of people on warfarin, and SSRIs increase the risk of major hemorrhage. The effect was serious but rare. tricyclics didn't do it. And you can see over on the right, this is hemorrhage per 100 treatment years. So it's not very common, but a serious major hemorrhage that causes hospitalization is not a good thing to have. So you need to consider this in choosing the antidepressant. Should you try to choose one other than an SSRI, SNRI to avoid the problem, or given that it's so rare, do you go ahead and just give it? That would be a decision that I think would best be made with the patient, discussing it with the patient and get their reaction as well. And then finally, beta blockers and epinephrine. This last one, again, can be life-threatening, as with the first two, but this one is the most rare. The interaction itself is very well established. If you give systemic epinephrine, which is adrenaline, as you probably know, you get offsetting vasoconstriction, which is the upper thing there, the alpha-1 receptor, and vasodilation, which is the second one, the beta-2 receptor. So this leads to very small changes in the mean blood pressure. So this is why if you have an outpouring of epinephrine because you're afraid you're taking a test or a bear is chasing you or whatever, it doesn't kill you because that's a normal response. But nature hadn't anticipated that people might develop non-selective beta blockers, and what those do, things like propranolol, for example, what those do is block the beta-1, which we're not really worried about in this interaction, but they block the beta-2 vasodilation, and this leaves unopposed vasoconstriction, resulting in an acute hypertensive effect. Now, this acute hypertensive effect that occurs regularly, this occurs predictably in people. This can cause, only in rare susceptible people, it can cause a stroke, but it also can cause cardiac arrhythmias, which are not good, sometimes serious cardiac arrhythmias. But the good news is that the vast majority of people who get epinephrine don't get it systemically. The dermatologic use of it usually is not nearly enough, or dental use of it. Very rarely they use enough to cause a problem. And also it only happens with non-selective beta blockers, so it doesn't occur with the more commonly used selective agents like metoprolol. But and it only would cause a stroke if you already had some problem, some little vascular abnormality in your brain, most likely. So there are a lot of reasons why it doesn't cause stroke and serious arrhythmias. And this, by the way, same case, just to show that this is the subarachnoid hemorrhage. This is another way to bleed into your brain. So again, how do you handle this? Well, it would be on a case-by-case basis. But one thing you cannot do is assume that just because you haven't seen it, using induction, assume that just because you haven't seen any problems with this interaction, that it is not real. And that's the assumption that probably 99% of clinicians came to when this interaction was first described. They didn't believe it. They said, well, this can't be. I've seen that happen all the time. I have never seen a problem. So induction is clearly not a way to determine whether this will cause problems. So don't forget, there are many ways inductive reasoning can fail. It can fail to provide a realistic assessment of the dangers of a particular drug-drug interaction. And this can result in failure to manage drug-drug interactions in a way that will minimize the risk to patients. And the third one, which won't take us long, abductive reasoning. This is the inference to the best explanation, looking at all the evidence and coming to the best conclusion. Suppose you see a patient who develops colchicine toxicity after starting clarithromycin. If this is one of the first cases, which I'll show you on the next slide, you might have to use abductive reasoning. There are no randomized controlled trials of this, so what you would do there is you would look at, you would use the process of looking at what information we do have on this. This was a 65-year-old man on colchicine, was started on clarithromycin. After 4 days, he had fever, myalgia, abdominal pain, and he developed pancytopenia. His white cells, his bone marrow stopped producing enough white cells and platelets, etc., and also multi-organ failure, and it killed him. They diagnosed clarithromycin-induced colchicine toxicity, and here they used not a randomized controlled trial, but just the properties of colchicine and clarithromycin. They knew colchicine was a CYP3A4 substrate. They knew, and a P-glycoprotein substrate. They knew that clarithromycin inhibited those things, and so they came to that conclusion. There are now more than 24 case reports of this interaction between colchicine and clarithromycin. So this is what they knew at the time, that it's metabolized by 3A4 in the liver and the intestinal wall, and also a substrate for P-glycoprotein, and drugs that inhibit these two, this enzyme and that transporter, would be expected to cause colchicine toxicity. So they looked at theoretical issues and came to the conclusion. As I said, clarithromycin is just such a drug. It inhibits both of those things. By the way, colchicine comes from this beautiful plant on the right, also called the autumn crocus. So such a beautiful plant can be very dangerous in the wrong situations. So now we can use abductive reasoning, because we have not only all those case reports, but we also have pharmacokinetic data. This was 23 healthy subjects given a single dose of colchicine before and after clarithromycin, and sure enough, there was a mean increase of 212 in the area under the curve, the serum concentrations. But the one person with the largest effect had an 852% increase. So in some people, it can be very large. So we have case reports, we have pharmacokinetic data, we have a case series where these people on colchicine and clarithromycin, they found that fatal colchicine toxicity was over 6 times greater when the overlap of the drugs was more than 2 days. Again, usually from organ failure and pancytopenia. The FDA, by the way, has received more than 60 reports. Now it's probably closer to 100 from this drug interaction. It's a nasty death. The patient just marinates in colchicine and dies slowly. There's nothing you can do to stop it. You can't dialyze it. So we have all kinds of information now from case reports, case series, pharmacokinetic data, and theoretical, obviously, to suggest that colchicine and clarithromycin interact. No randomized controlled trials, but there's enough evidence here to make it very clear what's going on. And by the way, colchicine's been used for 3,500 years. A reference to colchicine for joint pain appears in the Ebers Papyrus from 1500 BCE. Pretty amazing. And that's the actual papyrus that talks about it. So don't forget, we use deduction when we apply known principles to specific cases, which is usually fairly straightforward. We still make mistakes, but it's straightforward. We use induction to arrive at general conclusions or principles, and there are a lot of pitfalls, and I went through some of those. And finally, we use abduction, or inference to the best explanation, when we use all pertinent evidence to arrive at the best possible conclusions. This last method is actually underused, especially when we're dealing with sometimes public health problems where people demand randomized controlled trials when what they should be doing is looking at all the evidence and coming to conclusions. Okay, that concludes our video on scientific inference. Thank you very much for your attention.